How's everybody doing this morning? Beautiful. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Arts Lecture Series. My name is Catalina Ocampo Londoño. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a member of the faculty here at Evergreen. I teach Latin American Studies and Creative Writing. And it is a tremendous pleasure to have Rafael Soldi today as our guest artist for this week's art lecture. As we start, I would like to gratefully acknowledge and honor the Squaxin Island tribe, upon whose traditional homelands the Evergreen State College is located. For thousands of years, their ancestral families lived and thrived here. They named Bud Inlet, Setchas, and Eld Inlet, where the campus is located, Squeatl. Today, the Squaxin Island tribe continues to live on and steward the lands and waters of the southern Salish Sea. We also gratefully acknowledge the Puyallup tribe, whose traditional lands Evergreen Tacoma campus is located upon. We respect and acknowledge the Squaxin Island and Puyallup tribes and other tribes across the Americas, and their many contributions to the Evergreen State College in support of education, tribal sovereignty, environmental stewardship. This acknowledgement is one small step towards respect and collaboration with the aim of uplifting the voices, cultures, and histories of the tribes of these lands and waters. I would like to extend a warm welcome to Rafael Soldi, our guest artist for today's Arts Lecture Series, which is co-organized with the program Reorienting Identity, Image-Text Collaborations. Our program, which is taught by myself and Rosario Gordon, focuses on ways that image and text collaborate and can be connected and brought together in the same space. So it's really wonderful to have Rafael Soldi with us and see some of the ways that he has done that in his work. Before introducing Rafael, just want to give you a few reminders. There will be one final lecture for the year during week 8 on Wednesday, May 22nd from 11:30 to 1 p.m. That lecture will be offered by Stefan Bird-Pola, a professor of philosophy and aesthetics who will be talking about film. That will be in person here in the recital hall and will be simultaneously live streamed on Zoom. For today's art lecture series, we have a slightly different schedule than usual, so we'll be going from 10 a.m. to noon, and after hearing from our guest artist, we'll be finishing with some Q&A. So as you listen, I invite you to think of questions that you might want to ask Rafael. And both the live audience and our audience on Zoom will be invited to offer questions. So if you are on Zoom today, please offer questions at the end. So welcome to Rafael. Rafael Soldi is a Peruvian-born artist and independent curator based in Seattle, in the unceded indigenous land of the Coast Salish people. He uses video, photography, installation, text, and performance to reflect on masculinity, language, immigration, violence, and memory, informed by his queer Peruvian identity. Rafael weaves personal history with collective memory to explore how gender expectations are encoded and can be subverted within language and childhood games. Recent works index a type of masculinity largely governed by violence that barely conceals an urgent need for intimacy and connection. I have to say I had a particularly powerful experience with a text and a work that I hope Rafael references today titled Mouth to Mouth, which makes space for bilingual queer punning and translingual space, opening up some space for those of us who move within those multilingual spaces. Rafael has exhibited internationally at the Frye Art Museum, the Frost Art Museum, the Griffin Museum of Photography in Clamp, among others. His work is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Fine Arts. Houston, Tacoma Art Museum, Frye Art Museum, King County Public Art Collection, and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He's the co-founder of the Strange Fire Collective, a project dedicated to highlighting work made by women, people of color, and queer and trans artists, and is also a co-curator of the High Wall, a yearly outdoor video projection program that invites immigrant artists and artists working on themes of diaspora and borderlands to intervene the facade of a former immigration building in the heart of Seattle. So thanks to Rafael for being here with us. It is a great pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. Is that good? Okay, I'm gonna set a timer so that I don't just talk all day. Let's see here. Perfect. Okay, how's everyone doing today? Good? All right, I see some thumbs up. Great. Okay, thank you, Catalina, Rosario. Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. It's really nice to get to see all of you, to be out here at Evergreen. I did this lecture several years ago, and I can't remember when. Was it 2018 maybe, I think? It's been a little while, so it's great to be back. I haven't been back since. And yeah, I'm gonna get started. As Catalina mentioned, my work is very rooted in my own experience, in my own sort of biography as a queer person, as a Latin American person, as a Spanish-speaking person, and you'll see that kind of come out throughout my work. But my aim is always to take my own experiences, to take my my personal experience and connect it to a larger sort of global exploration or larger question of the world. So I hope that you get to see yourself or your own life reflected as well in some of the things I'm talking about. And I would love to have a conversation later, answer your questions, and you know, just kind of setting that intention from the beginning that I know there's a bit of a power structure here where I'm standing here and you're all standing over there, but we are in the same room. So I hope that later we can just be in conversation, which is my favorite part of all of this. So I'll try to not talk at you for too long. I'm going to start with actually a couple of things. Those of you who took Catalina's class last quarter and went to my talk, I don't think I touched on this, but I love to talk about some of these curatorial projects with students because I think there's a lot of opportunity for you to create your own spaces and to create things that are important and powerful to you. I know that Evergreen particularly is a school that has always been very politically active, where students have always had a lot to say. And we, you know, the Strange Fire Collective, which Catalina explained earlier, is a project that was founded by myself and Jess T. Dugan and Hamida Glasgow and Zora Murph. And it was founded at a time when we are all artists working across mediums, but have a strong sort of foundation in photography. And we were feeling that we were not finding stories in the art world that we were occupying that reflected ourselves. We weren't finding stories that talked about queerness, that talked about blackness, that talked about feminism. You could find it, but it was kind of hard to get to, you know? There wasn't a place where you could really go and explore those topics and find content that was meaningful, that was original, where, you know, even all of us have taught at some point where we could find resources for our students to send them to without sending them like 25 different links to different little bits of things. So we decided to just create our own thing. It started as the Strange Fire Collective is the name that we gave it. And it started as a website, and we decided that the basis of what we would do would be that there's 4 of us. Each of us would take on 1 week out of the month, and we would do an in-depth interview or conversation with an artist, a writer, or a curator who, you know, had something to say that we were interested in, whether it was about social justice or their own identity, their own work. And naturally, the 4 of us had sort of our own interests within, you know, some of us were more interested in exploring race, some of us were more interested in exploring queerness or feminism, but, you know, we saw all of these topics as being obviously connected, obviously intersectional. And so it started as these weekly features, which very quickly grew into an archive of, I think it was like 120 plus interviews by the time we closed down the project. But it was a great place to find just weekly content. And then we started doing exhibitions and publication reviews and so on. I'll go over that. But I like to share this project because we were just four people who were friends who had an idea. I think our budget for the year was like $120 just to like pay for the website. Obviously, in an ideal world, I would have paid every artist who gave their time to us with the interviews. But and then it was a lot of our time. It was a lot of work. It was a big commitment. I think 6 months in, we were like, oh, what do we do? Like we really committed to, you thought like, oh, an interview a month is fine, and then you realize it's actually quite a bit of work to, reach out to someone, do a lot of research, have an in-depth conversation, transcribe it, edit it, go back and forth, publish it, get images. It's a lot of work, but it was work that we did for 7 years. And we got to a point where toward the end of the project, universities and galleries were coming out to us saying, hey, we want you to do programming. Can you come to our school? Can we give you $50,000 to program something? Can we do this? And it started from nothing. And I say that because any of you, this idea is not new. You can steal it. There's been collectives before us. There'll be collectives after us. It was an education. For me, it was like doing my own MFA. I was selfishly choosing to speak to artists who were speaking to the themes in my work I was exploring at that time. It became like this great excuse, especially as the project grew, to reach out to artists who were maybe higher profile and get to have a phone call with them and kind of poke their brain a little bit. This is an exhibition I curated toward the end of the project in Seattle called Momentous Gesture. And I'll just kind of run through some of these projects, but it was a really great way to be in community too. We would have these group calls I would say maybe like every once a month with my colleagues, and it was this great opportunity to have conversations about who we were interviewing. There were certainly times when one of us disagreed with whether someone should be featured on the collective for whatever reason, and those were very spirited conversations that were really productive and really interesting in terms of just what identities we felt aligned with the message that we were trying to send and things like that. These are some more of the exhibitions that we planned over time. We also did a number of public programs. As you can see, we worked a lot with students and visited campuses and just had a really great time. And then we also produced publications for every exhibition that we curated as well. This was all done just with our time. Sometimes there was a little budget if we were commissioned to do something, but for the most part, we didn't make a penny from this project. And not to romanticize that, we just didn't have the time to go out there and find funding. But if you want to get paid, you absolutely can and should. And writing grants and stuff, all of those things are possible. So when you leave school, you'll find that it can be really hard because you lose a lot of your community. You don't have to, but you lose this kind of space that you have here, your facilities, your faculty, a lot of the support that you have. So I find that projects like this were really powerful ways to stay engaged. We did some book reviews as well. And then we also did these educational resources that anyone here can access. And there might be slightly outdated because we wrapped up the project in 2022 and are not going to update it moving forward. It has been archived, but there's still great content. We have a section on addressing accessibility, a really wonderful section of alternative canons, which basically is a list of famous books and texts that says if you typically assign this old white guy here's another text that talks about the same thing that's not by an all white guy, and a list of kind of long texts that have been like cemented into the canon, and then it offers alternatives to those texts. I still think all of those texts are worth reading. I just think it's really important and interesting to see another perspective on the same topic and sort of compare some of those thoughts. So that's a wonderful resource for the teachers and the students in the room as well if you're looking for a specific topic. And then I'll mention also the high wall, which I know Catalina mentioned as well, but it's a project that was founded by a colleague of mine, and then I kind of joined in later. Her name is Britta Johnson, and it's a project that invites video artists to project their own work to the facade of the Inkscape building in Seattle. I'm gonna lower this for right now, but this is Alice Gosti. She's a Italian immigrant to the U.S. Choreographer who did this wonderful piece that was projected on the facade. So the Inkscape building in Seattle is a former immigration detention facility that was actually in use all the way up until the 90s, I believe. It has now been turned into a artist studio building. But it used to be essentially a jail. And it's a jail where we jailed immigrants that came into the US. And it's also a place where during World War II, when we put Japanese Americans and Japanese people into internment camps, yes, we had concentration camps here in the United States, also here in Washington. This is the place where also this detention center is in what we call the International District, which is kind of the center of Asian American life in Seattle. And this was a place where the leaders of Japanese communities were incarcerated so that they would be separated from the communities that were sent to the internment camps because they didn't want them to be organizing their communities in the camps. So it has a very dark history, and it felt when it became this art building, and I should say, like, if you walk in, they've done a very good job of addressing the elephant in the room, like what the building is. If you can't walk an inch in the building without seeing history, panels, information, there's tours, all kinds of stuff. But this became a great way to invite artists to reclaim that space, to project their own work. This is one of my favorite pieces by Nadia Ahmed. She's a young artist based in Seattle, and it's called Emotional Labor. And it is a piece of just her sitting, staring at you in that chair. And if you choose so, you can purchase the piece. And in purchasing the piece, you're purchasing her time. So you're purchasing the emotional labor that she puts in on a daily basis to just exist in our world. And it's a really powerful, so you buy it by the minute, I think. It's a really powerful piece that I really loved. And it was really, to use the word again, but very powerful to walk by the building. And you can see it from the light rail too, and see her just sitting there. It looks like a picture, but then you see her blink, just sort of waiting. So I wanted to share those projects because they are a part of my practice. They are a big part of my life. And I think that for those of you who are exiting school eventually and making your own way through the world, there are so many ways to engage with your practice, with your peers, with your communities that can be very meaningful, that don't have to be strictly through creating things, through writing something or making art in one kind of way. So these projects for me are very just fruitful. They really inform a lot of my practice beyond that. So I'm gonna hop over now to my artwork, I guess. And I will start briefly. I'm gonna start at the beginning, but I'm gonna go fast first and then slow down a little bit because I wanna give you some context, but I also wanna talk about the stuff I'm working on now that's very relevant to a lot of folks in the room here as well who are in Catalina and Rosario's class. But Imagine Futures is a body of work that's comprised of 36, well, I should say originally 50, I'll get into that, but these are 50 photographs of myself. I hesitate to call them self-portraits, we'll talk about that, but they're photographs of myself made in a photo booth, a traditional black and white photo booth, like I'm sure you may have encountered maybe in the past. They're still around. And these are photographs that were made in response to a, a very basic but sort of big question, which is what do we do with the lives that we leave behind in the countries that we're from? And I'm wondering if you can, if you're comfortable, if you're in this room and you can raise your hand if you're either an immigrant yourself or the child of immigrants. Okay, quite a few of you. So you may have experienced this yourself or heard your family members talk about it, but you know, immigration is a very dislocating experience. Um, Even if you immigrate for a better life and you find a better life, it can still be very difficult, not just to leave your life behind, but to live with the question of what is it that you left behind. How, you know, what happens with that part of yourself? Um, who gets to live that life? What could life had been like if you hadn't left? And I find that for me, I started asking myself that question more and more and more, and it became sort of more difficult over time. I started wondering, you know, what if I'd never left Peru? What could my life have looked like there? What I knew I didn't want to go back. I knew that as a queer person in Peru, my life would not be as good as the one I have right now here in the States. And I just became very obsessed with that. And I realized over time, after talking to other friends who are immigrants as well, that they were asking themselves the same questions. And that what I was experiencing and what I was thinking about was really grief. That we don't have a framework for grieving the life that we leave behind. We don't fully have a way to acknowledge that even though our bodies are here, parts of our psyche are somewhere else. Our families also may be somewhere else. We may have left parents, siblings, children, and I needed to find a way to address this. And I wasn't sure how that was going to happen, but I knew that it had to be more than drawing something or taking a picture of something. And this, I'm going to stop there and then back up to a few years before that, to 2016. On the evening that Donald Trump was elected, I was in Berlin at an artist residency. It was my first time voting as an American citizen, and it was strange to be, even though it was my first time voting, I had been here for many elections before. It was strange to be in another country when such a kind of momentous election was happening here in the States. I and many other people were completely shocked. That's not the result we were expecting, and I was very upset. It was late at night over there when we got the news, and I just became really afraid. I was really, really afraid, and I was walking back to my studio, and I saw a photo booth, and I remember feeling in that moment I had a sort of like a sense of panic, and I was like, I need to. There was a lot of people on the street. It was a weird energy, and I was like, I need a moment to myself. Like, I really need to just step away for a second because this is a lot. And I stepped into this photo booth, and I like closed the little curtain, and I just sat there, and I found myself thinking, I don't know what the future is going to look like for myself and for my friends, many of whom are queer, are people of color, are women, are trans, and are immigrants. I just don't know what this means for them, what this means for us, for my community. And it felt in that moment that I needed to document that. And I just fed the machine a coin, and I closed my eyes, and I tried to imagine perhaps a future that was different, that was better. And I made 4 pictures. And I kept that strip as my bookmark for years. And when I was thinking about this project a few years later, in about 2018 or so, and I was trying to figure out a way, I was like, how do we grieve the life that we left behind? How do I create some kind of ritual or space to address that? I found that strip and realized that maybe there was something powerful in that action, in that surged in that moment. And I started to use the photo booth as a space for ritual and performance, and I realized quickly that the photo booth uh, reminded me so much of the Catholic confessional, which is I grew up Catholic and spent a lot of time in that little room confessing my sins to a strange man on the other side of a curtain, which I always found very uncomfortable. Um, I always found that in those times, I went deep, deep inside myself as a young kid because I knew I was queer, but I knew I couldn't say it. So I knew I was living in sin. And so there was all these feelings that kind of resurged. And I was like, this is my chance to use the photo booth as an opportunity to reclaim the confessional, to reclaim my experience, and to also create some kind of ritual that allows me to let go of all of these imagined futures, all these lives I'm imagining that I've left behind, and shift my focus a little bit to what I'm living right now. Not necessarily to um, erase it, but just to address it. And what I would do would be every time an imagined future would visit me, I would find a photo booth, or I would write it down. It's not that I could just leave my house and go find a photo booth, but I would usually write it down when I found myself thinking or imagining or just getting anxious about thinking everything that was left behind. And I would find a booth, I would step into it, close the curtain, close my eyes, and just say thank you for visiting. I'm glad that you're here, but I'm giving you permission to go. It's time to maybe find someone else to live you. That life that I left behind that I keep thinking about and imagining, maybe it's better suited for someone else. And there's someone else out there who perhaps can be a vessel for you, but it's not me. And it became this really powerful ritual that over time, I did it 50 times. Took a photograph while I was doing that. I would cut it out and then put it in a frame, and then became this installation. And I said earlier that I don't often think of them as self-portraits, and I say that only because yes, I know it's a picture of myself, but I often just think of it more as documentation of a performance, of documentation of a ritual. And it's hard for me when I see the pictures because they weren't made, and I know it may sound silly, but they weren't made with this intention to like make a picture of me, but they were just like the booth was just an apparatus that I was in its womb. We were making this work together. I just have a relationship to them that I often forget that it's a picture of me almost because it's to me an image of that experience. Mentioned earlier, I did it 50 times, but I had an exhibition early in the life of the project where a box, they were packed in a few boxes, and a box was stolen from the FedEx truck, and those works were lost. So I lost 14, so I only have 36 now. And I did toy with the idea because I had, for every little picture that was stolen, I had the other three that I'd cut out but hadn't framed. And I was like, oh, I can just replace them. But then I was like, no, like the work is literally about letting go and letting these lives kind of find their own journey. Like, what am I doing here, not honoring kind of what they're asking for? I really wish they hadn't been stolen, but also the work is now 36 and it's just part of the life of the project. So the project was then turned into a book. This book was produced by Candor Arts, an amazing book publisher. They're still around, but they've changed their name. They've kind of restructured. But an amazing publisher in Chicago that made handmade artist books, and they did just a beautiful job with the project. We never intended for the book to feel like a Bible, but I kind of love that it does. It's this black box with this gold text. And we were really, really struggling to figure out what to do with the cover. We had a pretty good idea of how we wanted the book to be formatted, but we weren't quite sure what to do with the cover. And we assumed it would be an image of some kind, maybe. And I found this picture that I thought would be a great cover. And I was like at this conference, very like tired and jet lagged, and I sent this frantic text message to my editor. And saying like, how about this picture, like think about it. And he was like, okay, let me think about it and I'll present you an option next week. And when I met with him next week, he had printed my text message on the cover of the book. And he was like, "I'm really nervous, but I hope you like it." And this is what the text says. It says, sorry for the late night text, but I am wide awake and a little jet lagged. I'm thinking about this photograph I made for another project. It's titled The Sun Will Set in the Same Place. It's the first work I made about my relationship to Peru, and it sparked an urge to mend that relationship. After this picture, I felt free enough to make imagined futures. I photographed it in my studio in response to this intense nostalgia I felt once, very unexpectedly, when I moved to Seattle, and I saw the sun setting over the Pacific Ocean. I had been living on the East Coast prior, where the sun sets behind a building or a field. I grew up on the Pacific, and although sunsets were not a particularly memorable part of my childhood, I only knew the sun to set on the ocean. When I saw it again 15 years later, this time, I immediately thought of home, and how, even though I am 5,000 miles away from Peru, this was the exact same sun setting over the exact same ocean, and how perhaps home is not really a place, but a memory, or that which you choose to carry with you, and that no matter how far away I run, I can't escape where I'm from. We are forever linked. So it was time to make peace with it, and that moment, as I watched the sun disappear on the Pacific again, was very comforting. I felt at home, and it was familiar, and it was also okay. I like the ambiguity of this image as well. It's like being blinded by the sun, or it could be an eclipse, or a black hole, or a camera shutter, or a moon, or an explosion, or a flash in memory, or a peephole. And then when you open the book, the photograph is revealed on the inside. And yeah, it was just this very powerful idea, and I love it. And it's kind of why I love collaboration. I think there's just some things that you just could never come up with on your own. And I think this book was my first kind of true collaboration, and it was such an amazing experience. Not all collaborations go well, but I do find that once you have a really fantastic experience collaborating and you open yourself up to just other people bringing a different type of depth to the ideas that you're working with, it's really magical, and you can start to become more discerning about choosing, who to collaborate with, and making sure those experiences are very fruitful. The book is in English and Spanish, and there's a text, an essay in the back by Miguel Lopez, who's a Peruvian writer and curator. And it's not meant to be a catalog, so we have some images, as you can see in the back, with some installation shots, but it's really meant to be about the portraits, and they are loose. We didn't want to bind them because it felt, again, that binding the images kind of gave the portraits this sort of foreverness, that again goes against the concept of the work. So it became also a way to liberate the images, and something that the editors really pushed me to think about, that I've kind of carried with me, is that the book is worthless if it's just a catalog of something that already exists. That the book was an opportunity to create something totally new, to create a new dimension for the project. And in this case, it was great because when you go to see the show, the images are fixed to the wall, so there is kind of a, logistically speaking, a bit of a finality to them. And the book allowed us to create this experience with the work that's completely different from seeing the show. And that's something that I'm really grateful for them pushing that, and kind of taking us away from, every time I was like, well, the work is shown like this, and they were like, it doesn't matter. That's a whole other experience. Like, we're making something new. And I really appreciated that. And then just to wrap up this project, I felt that it was a very powerful, sorry, I keep using that word, why? I don't know why, but it was an incredible experience that I felt was not really about me. Yes, I was talking about my life, but I'm only one of hundreds of thousands of people who have experienced the same thing. And I wanted to and I realized that I found a framework that helped me. So why not share that with other people? So I gathered a group. I worked with an amazing organization in Seattle called Entre Hermanos, and we gathered a group of queer Latinx men, and it was very specific, or I should say, male identifying folks. And it was very specific because I do think, and we'll find this later, that the more specific is, the more universal it becomes. Could we have done this with a much more diverse group? Probably. It probably would have also been a really great experience, but I found that since we had limited time and we were gathering a small group, getting hyper specific was really helpful because we came in already with much more in common, and we're able to build and get deeper and more vulnerable much quicker because our experiences were so, even though they were all very different, our identities were much more aligned. So I find that sometimes you have to sort of be unapologetically specific about who you invite and who you uninvite in order for something to have sort of the gravitas that it needs. And these are some of the images that we made that day. And if you're curious about this, we can talk about it more later, but I want to get to some new things. And then from that project, I'm going to hop on to Cargamonton. Cargamonton is a body of work comprised of 8 large-scale photogravures. Has anyone here done any printmaking before? Lovely, wonderful. So photogravure is a 19th century printmaking process used primarily to reproduce photographs. And this body of work touches on the ways in which violence is used primarily amongst young people, specifically in the playground, in order to, and when I say young people, I would say young men, in order to access intimacy with each other. Cargamonton is a game that we played growing up that I think is played all over. It's sort of a pig pile. For us specifically, the way it worked was that the bully would select the victim, often the queer kid, or a friend, or the nerd, or whomever, and then that person gets wrestled to the ground until, usually in the cement floor in the patio, until they're kind of held down, and then all the other kids will run and one by one jump and land very hard on top until that person is sort of suffocated under a pile of bodies. And it was playful, but it was also quite violent and sort of terrifying. And I often found myself at the bottom of that pile. I was also the perpetrator sometimes. I had never started it because I hate that stuff, but I certainly was in social situations where I felt like I had no choice but to get on top of the pile as well. But more often than not, I found myself kind of under. And this popped into my head because a friend of mine, or I should say like someone from my childhood, reached out at some point and reminded me that this happened. And I realized that I had erased it from my head. And as I started remembering it, I started to notice just how impactful this game was to me, but also how much of a sort of symbol it is for many other issues that you're going to hear from me later that I've continued to explore. I started to remember that in the early years as a young person, this game was for me, I was always a kid who was afraid of sort of like heavy like physical contact, like violence, sports, like anything that required sort of like aggression. I always kind of shied away from that. And in the early years, this game was really scary to me. And that as I grew a little older and I started to come to terms with my own sexuality, I also realized and sort of acknowledged my desire for other boys and kids in my school. I started to find the game both scary and erotic. So I started to find also that it became this kind of opportunity to be entangled in the body of my peers, and I should note, I went to an all-boys Catholic school. So there were like no women at all for the 12 years that we were there. And it was a really intense experience. And it became this opportunity to sort of like be intimate in a way, to feel their breath and their sweat, and for us to be, because we didn't hug, we weren't tender with each other in any way. And in this case, it's almost like a very aggressive cuddle puddle, you could say. And I started looking back and thinking about, oh my God, like all of these men were just looking for connection, maybe in different ways. Maybe a queer kid had a different experience, probably, than someone who wasn't queer. But at the end of the day, I think that to a degree, every person in that group was looking for a way for our bodies to connect. And I started to think a lot about, like, something just kind of clicked in my head, and I started to think a lot about the ways we used play and rituals in school, specifically in this container, in order to access intimacy with each other. My first step in the project was to go back and find evidence, because I did feel sort of gaslit, because when I brought this up and I started talking to friends, and like my siblings went to my school too, and I would be like, do you remember this? Like, this happened, like it was kind of intense and scary, and people would be like, yeah, I guess, yeah, I mean, it was just like, I don't know, we're just playing around, we were kids. And I was just like, am I crazy? Like, am I the only one who like doesn't realizing that this thing is actually kind of a big deal, that it wasn't, I don't know. So I went back and I went to YouTube and I typed like Cargamonton, Peru, children, like young school, like stuff. And I found an incredible sort of trove archive of videos that young teens in Peru had posted to YouTube, of like just them hazing each other and like doing this specific thing. And all the videos were almost primarily from the early 2000s, which is just a few years after I left high school. And I realized that it was a very specific time when kids did not have social media, they did not have phones, but they had camcorders and sort of digital cameras with video capabilities. And they were bringing them to school for the first time, and they were filming themselves doing all this stuff. So all of a sudden there was like a third layer of like surveillance and like a third viewer. Now these acts were also entering like an archive, like YouTube, like the public consciousness. So that became really interesting to me as well. But more importantly, in seeing these videos, I quickly realized that I remembered it just right. Like, you could see just in those videos who was having fun and who was not having fun. You could see just the edges of violence. You could see the edges of pleasure. Like, it was just very clear to me. And I realized that this game was essentially an archaeological site, that I could excavate from it a much larger exploration of masculinity, and really dig into this idea that the performance of gender, what I call the theater of masculinity, and more specifically, we'll talk about this later too, but as I engaged with bell hooks, I really kind of realized that the only way to explore this issue is through a feminist lens, and I'll get there. But so what you're looking at is stills from these videos that I found. And there are stills that I specifically selected because I liked the way in which they blurred the line between torture and pleasure. I liked that without a lot of context, a viewer will have to make the decision for themselves as to what they're looking at. Are they witnessing a torture scene, or are they witnessing children at play? Are these kids or are these adults? And it's something that I do a lot with my work, and something that I love doing, which is to put the viewer, I think complicated issues require a complicated lens, and it puts the viewer in an uncomfortable position to kind of bring their own bias to the table. The images were printed, I'll come back to that, but the images were printed as photograph viewers for a number of reasons. I knew that I needed to visually unite the works. They came from different videos, different colors, different qualities, and that I needed to find a process through which I could do that. And also, I knew from the beginning that I wanted to deteriorate the image in a way that abstracted them just enough such that it allowed for some gray area in how we engage with the works. So the the files are go kind of from a digital place to a totally analog place. They start as this kind of 21st century technology in YouTube and video technology, and they end on a 19th century printmaking process. I worked with, I'll come back to that, but I did wanted to show you this piece by Barbara Kruger, who, those of you working with image and text, she's just such an incredible artist. And I found this image as I was working on this project, and it's basically just like my artist statement. Like if I could, instead of writing an artist statement, just put a little picture of this piece, that would be great. But it says, you construct intricate rituals which allow you to touch the skin of other men. She's just so good at saying something as simple as possible, but in the strongest way. You can see the whole set here, all 8 images in Houston at the museum. And then I'd love to show you just a little process of how these are made, and I can touch on that briefly. All right, and in the interest of time, I'm gonna move on, but if you have questions about the process, we can talk about it later. There's time for that. But I do wanna get to some later stuff, and happy to talk about printmaking process, other decisions that were made as well for that. And the next project I'll share, which is called Soft Boy, is a direct sort of offshoot of this. As I mentioned earlier, I realized that this was kind of just the opening to a much larger exploration around masculinity, specifically in Latinx culture with young men, and a lot of research that I've been doing around understanding the ways in which violence is used to access intimacy amongst men, and the ways in which sort of patriarchal masculinity hurts us. I went back to Peru and I worked with a group of 10 teenage boys. This is a film that was presented at the Fry Art Museum last fall, and it took about 5 years to sort of produce and get to this final piece, but it was filmed and edited last year. It's a 3-channel video installation. As you can tell, it's quite large. I don't like to make things large just to make them large, but in this case, I felt that it really needed to be an immersive experience. I wanted the viewer to feel very overwhelmed by the bodies they were surrounded by. So you could probably imagine, I think each one of these screens is about the size of this whole screen here. So when they're put together, they're quite immersive. I sort of created a list or a glossary of all of these different rituals that, whether they were subtle or overt, whether they were sort of violent or not. I mean, I think almost all of them are inherently violent in some way, but sometimes it's not apparent how so. There were so many sort of flavors of like military culture, so many ways in which we were taught to be men or to be real men, ways in which rituals that affected our behavior, that influenced how we interacted with each other, ways in which I think we seek connection. And I wanted to highlight all of that, and I worked with this amazing group of teenage boys to sort of scripted. It wasn't fully scripted. Everything was improvised, but it was responding to prompts that I was kind of sending their way. We spent 2 days sort of preparing, having very in-depth conversations with the boys, with everybody in the crew, doing a lot of rehearsal, and then 2 days filming, 2 very long days filming. And I'll show you just a little video of how it felt to kind of be in the room when this was installed. And then I'm also going to show you a little sort of trailer for the film, which shows you kind of the imagery and some of the sound design a little bit better.
Contigo no puedo, contigo no puedo, ya, pero... ¿Por qué pones esa cara? Yo estoy tranquilo. Estamos jugando. Yo también estoy jugando. Ah, que no vas a jugar. A mí no, a él. ¿Ya? ¿Terminó?
Descanso. Atención.
All right, so that gives you a sense for the work, and I'm happy to kind of expand on this later too. I'll show you some stills from the film. It was a really incredible experience. I was really scared going into it because I had never made work in Peru. I had never talked about these subjects in Spanish. I'd never talked about these subjects with men in Peru. I was curious to see how receptive they would be to my ideas. I was curious to see how open they would be to talking about this, and I found that they were very open and very receptive. And here's some images from the production as well. I was really inspired by the young men who were involved in the project because they were so vulnerable and so open, like they were up for anything, and they just really brought a lot to the project. I took a lot from their own lived experience and from their own body language to influence how, kind of the film ended up being edited and some of the actions that we included in there as well. There they are. At the end of the film, we did a 2 hour long conversation with them. This is what that setup is from. That was filmed. It didn't make it into the final film, but I am producing like a segment of that conversation because I think is really important. There were some moments in the filming where they were asked to kind of hug each other, and there's a moment where one of them started crying, and then later in the conversation, his like hug partner asks him, "Can you tell me like why you were crying?" And he said, "I'm crying because this is the way I've always wished my father would hug me." And it was just such a like a beautiful moment to hear that. And there were just some lots of other experiences. There were moments where you saw the boy who was kind of being swung around. He was the only boy who was not Peruvian. He's from Venezuela, and he'd heard that we had called that game Tupac Amaru, and he was like, "What does that mean?" And I hadn't even thought about it, and we played it my whole life when we were kids until I realized that, well, I've known what it is, but until I made the connection to this topic, which is, Tupac Amaru was an Inca leader, an Inca king who was dismembered by the Spaniards by tying a horse to each limb and then pulling back. So we'd play this game where we would like grab someone and like pull their legs and their arms or swing them around. And I hadn't thought about it until we were doing this and the kids were explaining to him also these kind of links, these deep links to our colonial history, to colonization, to violence, and the ways we glorify that violence, and then immediately bring it right into these rituals of masculinity. So that was really interesting also, and it's a conversation that they had amongst themselves. And that came up through them, so that was really interesting as well. Now I want to bring you to the end where I want to talk about two projects with words. This is a poem by Puerto Rican poet Jay Hopler. The poem is called Family Astrology, and this is the first line from the poem, and it says, "Those aren't shards, those aren't stars, those are shards of my mother's bone." And that's where the title for this piece come from, Shards. And this is a piece, it's hard to see, but I'll show you in a minute. It's a piece composed of 4 panels. Each panel has a photograph, a gelatin silver print of a night sky in the back, and then a piece of etched glass in the front with a word on it. And the sky in the background are photographs that I took in Peru at the Space Observatory, and they're photographs of the sky as it looked the moment my mother gave birth to me over her. So they were able to kind of dial in the observatory. They have like a technology where they can show you what the sky looked like at that time. And so I was trying to think, these were made many, many years ago, the photographs. And it's a time when I was really wrestling with just understanding my identity and trying to connect with what makes me Peruvian, what makes me from there. And there were just so many things culturally that didn't quite fit with who I am and with how I feel. But then there were some things that felt so just sort of that I couldn't escape. And one of them was just that I was birthed there, right? Like my mother gave birth to me in that place at that time. And that's something that's with me for the rest of my life. And I wanted to understand that a little better. And I had at the time, in sort of a search to engage with the topic, and maybe as part of my research, I started talking to brujas, to like witches and palm readers, and just because I was curious to see what they had to say. Just like I find that I'm really interested in tarot reading and all of that, not necessarily because I believe that it'll tell me the future, but just because I think it opens your mind to just kind of thinking a little deeper about what you're going through right now, or your past, or your future. And so I went to Peru, and thinking about astrology and thinking about the universe, I wanted to see what it would feel like to stand under the same sky that my mom, stood or laid under as I came into the world. What would I have seen if I could see? And I made those photographs. And then later, they kind of made their way into this work. So there's 4 panels. One of them says tongue. One of them says soft. The other one says boy. and the other one says mother. And they're really, they come from two terms that I've used a lot in my work in talking about my work. One of them is mother tongue, and the other one is soft boy. And I was interested to see what would happen if I hung them in a way that was not didactic, so the reader necessarily wouldn't see right away mother tongue or soft boy. But again, if you, depending what your bias is or where you come from or what your history is, you may come to the work and see soft mother, you might see soft boy, you might see boy tongue, you might see soft tongue, you might see mother boy. And I like the way in which all of these words created sort of this, I was going to say infinite, but not really infinite, finite amount of sort of haikus, I know what you would call them, but word pairings that when you mix them up, each had an incredibly different and unique interpretation, and that someone might read soft tongue and feel uncomfortable with that, or someone might read mother boy or boy tongue and feel uncomfortable with that, or maybe might feel aroused, or maybe might find it very poetic, or, and I like all of those opportunities, right? All of those readings are correct. And that's kind of where that, how that piece came about. And it was also my first time kind of working with text. And that brings us to mouth, which is the last thing I want to share with you. And Catalina mentioned it earlier. And the title of the piece comes from a piece of text by Cecilia Vicuña, and it says, "Language is migrant. Words move from language to language, from culture to culture, from mouth to mouth. Our bodies are migrants. Cells and bacteria are migrants too. Even galaxies migrate." What is then this talk against migrants? It can only be talk against ourselves, against life itself. And this is very new work for me. These are just installation shots, they're hard to see, so I'm gonna get a little closer. And I started to just kind of think about language. I started to realize that language was a huge part of my migration story, that coming to the US, not speaking English, was like, I did something incredible that many migrants do, which is come to a new place and learn a whole new ass language. Like, that's crazy, and people do it all the time, every day. And that there was something really powerful. I think there came a point in my life when I started to feel that my Spanish was slipping and that I was losing my grip with it. But at the same time, my English wasn't strong enough that I could fully be really comfortable in it. And I felt kind of orphaned between these two languages. And I was trying to navigate that. And now I've come into really feeling much more comfortable with English. And I have all this anxiety around losing my Spanish. And, I was really fascinated by that. I also realized that not being a native speaker, that I would sometimes hear or mishear something, and the way I heard it was not quite right, but it felt right. Or it made a completely new meaning for that word or for that thing. And likewise with Spanish. So, a good example here, toward the middle, you see sistema, which means system. But if you were to spell it a little differently and separate it, it would say sistema, which means cis theme. And which got me thinking of obviously a lot about, sort of the systems and structures that have been built around cisness. And, realizing that CC, which I've always thought of as the affirmative yes, yes, but Alice mentioned to me last time that, of course, without an accent, it also means if, which I've been thinking about that since then. And I love that so much. But also, it could also be read as sissy. And just there's this kind of exchange between, the two languages that can give something two meanings that are equally strong. I think about, in English, like in the queer community or in general, when they talk about sex positions, they say top and bottom. In Spanish, they say activo and pasivo, active and passive. and started thinking a lot about like, well, that's really interesting. Like that's a power dynamic that, you know, I want to think about a little more. Like, what does it mean to be passive? What does it mean to be active? And then, you know, the word body appears a lot. I think in the project there's nobody, there's homebody, there's somebody. Um, we have, you know, housing also appears a lot in house, like rough housing. At the bottom, you see maricon dream, which means a faggot's dream, but also sounds like American dream as well. It's spelled almost exactly the same. The word maricon and the word American are almost identical. Or the way I one time accidentally spelled tomboy as tombboy. And, you know, there's been many times when I've seen or thought about how easily I could have ended up dead. I think about the word asco, which means disgust, I guess you could say, which is often used to refer to queer people. I think about the word loca, which means crazy, and the female, that is often used to describe a sort of flamboyant gay man. But, you know, why does, but it's also, you know, taps into this history of labeling women as hysterical or crazy. And it's obviously used in a derogatory way when they're referring to like a flamboyant, out of control gay man who's obviously deviant, who's not, you know, not acting right. So I love the idea that the first thing you name them is a crazy woman. Like that's just really interesting to me. Same in a conversation about language, someone talking about their first tongue, I immediately heard forest tongue. So what would it look like for the forest to have a tongue? So as you can see that, you know, there isn't kind of one current that all these words follow, that these investigations follow, but it's really about realizing that language is really malleable, that language carries a lot of power, and language carries a lot of gender and bias structure. Language is an institution, and language changes all the time. And sometimes we think that it can't, but it can. And this was kind of my response to that. It became a diary. It became, you know, many years of writing things down, of thinking about how things are spelled, thinking about the connections between languages. You know, the fact that historia, history, and hysteria, hysteria are spelled also almost exactly the same way. And likewise with poema and problema, with poem and problem. So when does a poem become a problem, and when does a problem become a poem? I don't know. We can talk about that. But I'll leave you with that, and I'm happy to talk more about this. One quick thing that I'll mention is that obviously, as you can tell, the work is bilingual. It's in Spanish and in English. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to make work for a specific audience. And I've realized that I want to be as specific as I can with who I'm making work for. When we had the exhibition at the Fry Art Museum where this was shown, we translated all the texts to English and Spanish. That was really important to me, the didactics, the wall labels. But someone approached the museum staff and asked them if they could please translate the words on the wall, and I kindly declined, because it was really important to me to understand that the work is not for them. That it doesn't mean they can't see it, and it doesn't mean they can't engage with it. It just means that you can only engage with it in the way that your experience allows you to. That likely, if a person who is queer and bilingual and Latino comes into the room, they're probably the one who's going to understand the work the most. Then maybe a person who's bilingual and not queer will understand it quite well. Then someone who's maybe somewhat bilingual, and then someone who doesn't speak Spanish at all will only understand some of it. But we have asked immigrants and non-native speakers to assimilate themselves constantly. So this work asks the viewer to assimilate themselves to it, to just find a way to fit themselves within the work. And if it's not fully for you, it's not fully for you. I'm gonna leave it at that, and I'd love to have some some conversation, some questions, and thank you very much.
Is this what I need to use for the... Wonderful, thank you. Is this working? Hello. Okay, now it's working. Thank you, Rafael. That was so wonderful. So many invitations to think about. I really appreciate the generosity of your work and the way that it, invites us in and also challenges us in so many ways. So want to turn it back to the audience online, and students in the room, and see if we have any questions. And really inviting students too from reorienting identity to think about some connections with things that we've seen in our class, and to think about questions you might have for Rafael. So I do see one question, Chris, and there are mics on the top, so just feel free to ask your question.
Did everybody hear the question up there? Universal. Yeah, the more universal, yeah. Yeah, and I heard that somewhere. I don't know. I didn't make it up, but it's yeah, it's become a huge part of how I make work. The more specific something is, the more universal it becomes. The minute you start kind of catering to the masses, the more you have to strip away sort of your story in order for it to be palatable for everybody. And sometimes you just have to be okay with it really truly being for some people, and everybody else can just figure out what they do with it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Other questions? Wondering if there's any online yet. Not yet. Okay. One question over there. Yes. Luz.
First of all, thank you for being here. I was kind of jotting down some notes while you were speaking, and I've written a question about how Spanish and English informs your work, and kind of answered it as you moved into the final pieces of your presentation. I was wondering, I'm also Peruvian, so this is a really beautiful, important talk to me. Does Quechua or Aymara play into your work at all? Because growing up in Peru, place names, animals, everyday objects have these indigenous names that seep through into the current culture, inform the slang, and I was wondering if that informs your work at all?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. Yeah, so the native language of Peru, Quechua and Aymara, are both beautiful languages that are still alive and are still spoken. And I think there's a lot of efforts, especially lately, to keep those languages with us. I don't use it because it wasn't a part of my experience growing up necessarily, and also because I also should acknowledge very clearly that I'm the child of first-generation Peruvians who were children of Italian immigrants. So also, which is something that actually I'm thinking a lot about in work that I'm gonna make some work about that in the future. But I'm Peruvian, born and raised, but I'm not a native indigenous Peruvian as well. So I try to be very careful with, again, as we talked about specificity, about letting my work be reflective of my experience and not speaking for others. But yeah, I love that question. And yes, you are right that it's very present sometimes, much the way we experience Native American languages here too, where it's part of our everyday lives. And sometimes we don't realize even that a certain word actually came from, what root. So, but thank you, yeah.
Yes, McKenna.
Hi, thank you so much again for your talk. I got to see your exhibition at the Fry, and it was incredible to be in that room with the 3 screens and just the noise of it all. I was wondering if you would talk a bit more about the materials you use in your work and your connection to them. You have a lot of recurring aesthetics using black and white, frames mounted on walls, having a lot of space inside the frame. So I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit more about that and how that sort of impacts your work.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I do think about that a lot, and I'm someone who, especially in the recent years, have detached myself from medium specificity. I came up in the art world as a photographer. I went to art school for photography, and that's the medium that I learned first. But I find that with my work specifically and the themes that I'm looking to explore, that it's always ideas first. So I always try to think of what is it that I'm trying to say and what is the right medium for that. So I'm working on some new projects that I think will probably end up as sculptures. I've never made a sculpture in my life, but it just feels to me that it has to be that way. And film was a totally new medium for me. I had never worked with text before. So I think I've been really trying to be really, really conscious that I'm not relying on a medium simply because that's what I know. And that maybe in doing that, I'm robbing myself of making a work that is just far more complex and nuanced simply because I'm like, well, I know how to paint or I know how to take pictures or it has to be this way, right? And that's the reason you see a lot of collaboration in my work with editors, with filmmakers, with printmakers, because I also I know that I have a very high standard for what I want, and I don't pretend that I'm gonna become a master printer in 3 months, So it's been really amazing to have an idea and to then find people who are just the best at what they do and say, okay, how do we bring this to life? And I also know that can sound and feel a little bit unrealistic. We don't all have the opportunity to do that. It's taken me a long time. So I definitely started with what I knew, right? I started early in my career with just making the type of work that I could with the skills that I had. And then over time, as things developed, I was able to get funding. I mean, the reason the film took 5 years is not because I researched it for 5 years, it's because I didn't have money, So once I had the funding and the Fry show was lined up, I was able to actually pay for it. And I'm glad because in that time, the film that I wanted to make 5 years prior would have been just not that great. So I'm glad that I waited, So all in its time, yeah. Yeah.
On a similar note of like the aspects of collaboration and touching on that like universality and specificity kind of relationship, I'm curious like how does collaboration and inviting in a potentially like, I think about like specificity is like just you, right? And the more people that you invite into the process, the like less specific it becomes. So how does that collaboration affect the relationship within your work between universality and specificity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a bit of, it's that sort of dichotomy, right? Of like, you invite collaborators, but at the end of the day, it's your vision, And it depends on what it is too. It's like for all of these projects, they weren't necessarily collaborative projects in the sense that we were sharing authorship. I still think that these people are sharing some authorship in the work, absolutely. But I was coming to them with, I have an idea, I have a project that I'm going to present as an artist. Can you help me bring it to life, and what do you think? So at any point, I felt comfortable saying no. And at many points, I said no, where they'd say, like, how about this? And be like, that doesn't feel right to me, it doesn't quite fit, So, and usually by the time I arrive at collaboration, in this case, because it has been mostly collaboration on the production side, I'm coming to them with a pretty fully formed idea. maybe the idea is not fully formed around the sort of formal elements where we're figuring out together what something might look like. But there's certainly been cases where some things that they brought to the table I was just not super sure about, and they ended up winning me over, and with time they've become some of my favorite parts of those projects. So sometimes it's also just kind of sitting with your convictions, but also knowing when to take a little step back and say, I think you have a point here, let me sit with that, and then realizing that maybe it's quite brilliant, and you just have to kind of get you out of your own head. So it's definitely a fine balance, but I've never felt that I've had to make not a compromise, you do always make compromise, but I've never felt that I had to kind of sacrifice my vision for collaboration. I do think if you enter a project as, sharing authorship with someone from the very beginning, then you have to be ready for some of, what's the that famous saying in writing, like you have to kill your favorite, your favorite passage. Like you always, it's like you keep your favorite thing around, and eventually it's just the thing that has to go. So, yeah.
Shoshi back there.
Yeah, thank you so much. When you spoke about your parents being first generation immigrants to Peru, I would love to hear more about how seeing their relationship with language and being language learners affected your transition and your relationship you now have with like using Spanish and speaking English.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I have kind of a funny story about that. So I should clarify, my grandparents were first generation immigrants. My parents were born in Peru, but I did see, my grandmother was Italian, and she's the one I was closest with, and it was fascinating to see her kind of build a new life in Peru, like reinvent herself after World War II and having to work as a nurse in the war, and then coming to Peru and starting a completely new life. She actually became an archaeologist and an anthropologist and spent basically her entire life studying pre-Columbian culture. So I've had Peruvian culture and ancient culture, and someone you were asking about Quechua as well, has been just a huge part of my life since I was a kid, because my grandmother just researched pre-Columbian culture her entire life, and she was a native Italian speaker who learned Spanish and then learned English so that she could write and translate and all this stuff. But also my mother was born in Peru, but she lived in the US from age 6 to age 30, even though she never spoke English at home. So we didn't really know a lot of English. But what I've realized now is that I've never heard my mother curse once in Spanish, but she cursed in English our whole childhood. And I think it's because we just didn't know what she was saying. So it's kind of great. So I know it's a bit of a funny story, but language can be funny. It comes in a lot of flavors and shades. And so, yeah, there's always been this sort of, I think, multi-generational kind of language transfer in my family, from the Italian to the Spanish to the English. And it's been something I'm really interested in exploring. I think more and more, as time has gone by, the world has become so much more global, and it used to be that people just kind of stayed put and families stayed put, and now, almost all of us kind of come from somewhere else, or like it's very common, I think, to have these families that are multi-generational, that are, have multiple levels of kind of identity tied to different cultures. So I actually had a residency in Italy a few years ago where I went to do some research on a house, that kind of an ancestral home that my family had lived in, that was seized by the Nazis during World War II and used as a horse stable, and then they were able to get it back after the war. And I spent some time in that house, and it was really interesting to kind of connect with the part of my family history that I don't know a whole lot about or I don't feel super connected to. But I have very like closely related cousins and family members who are there that I had just never met before. So, and they're fascinated with Peru. Like they've come to visit before when I was little. I don't remember them, but they're also really interested with like the Peruvian family as well. So there's just like a fascinating identity shift in there too.
Carly, I had seen your hand. Yes.
So it seemed like you had a lot of ritual-based work. And so I was curious if you think, or if you would consider the process of creating that work a ritual on itself, or if there's like certain rituals you do follow, or you do when you are creating these pieces and these projects, or like what you're thinking behind that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, I think everything in life can be a ritual of sorts, and I think I think more of the whole practice as one large kind of ritual. I tend to think of art making and my practice in very extended and kind of long-term terms. I think when I got out of school, and you'll experience this too, school's really tough because you experience life quarter to quarter or semester to semester, and it feels like you're just like reinventing the wheel just like every 10 weeks, and it can be exhausting. Are you guys semesters or quarters? Quarters, yeah, even harder. And even 4 years feels like a long time when you're in school. And then, so it's interesting to get out of school and realize that if you want to be an artist, you might make work for 60 years. Like that's a really long freaking time to think about existing with your practice after you just did something that felt like a really long time. So I think, to go back to your question about rituals, I've been trying to think of the ritual of art making as this very expanded thing. For example, I've realized that I learn so much more about my work after it's been made than when I make it. I find that when I'm making work, I'm often just operating on my instincts, and I'm doing things that I think and hope will stick. But then it's once you have these conversations and people ask you really great questions that, I would tell you that probably 80% of the language I use during my talk are things that have come out of like people asking me questions, of having conversations with people about their work, of people commenting on my work. You get to know your work with time. It's kind of crazy to think that you might take a year to make something and now you know everything that there is to know about it, So like to me, this is a form of ritual as well. It's like I'm learning about you, you're learning about me as we're exploring this work together. And yeah, I think that the work, like you said, involves a lot of ritual because it responds to the human experience. And I think in a lot of ways, the things that we do are rituals and performances, every day. Like we all live in this kind of constructed world where we've decided there's kind of a set of rules that define some things and we're all performing within it. So I think it's kind of, for me, a lot of it is identifying what are those rituals, what are those performances, what are those, how are we interpreting life, and what do they say about, the people we are and the experiences that we kind of exist within. Mm-hmm.
More questions back there. Kayvon.
Yeah, okay, so question I had, I'm still trying to figure out how to word it exactly, but in relation to the software, the short film, I'm wondering, like, what do you think about how, like, so much of like masculinity and masculine friendships is reliant on how you are perceived by the men around you, and not your own like definition? Because I personally think that masculine, like the definition changes every person.
Yeah.
But when you get a group of men together, for some reason, it's just like there's no like, I'm trying to think of a good way to word it.
Yeah.
I can't. Like there's no like connection to masculinity, but it's also so like fragile. Like everybody wants to be seen as masculine, but at the same time, they won't have their own, they won't define what they see as masculine. And so how do you think that affects
Yeah.
just male friendships in general?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that, and thank you for noticing it too, because I think that's kind of the first step, is just realizing that something's off, and that it's not normal. I mean, what's normal, right? Nothing's normal. But, well, the first thing I'll say, just a suggestion to you and anybody else, if you're thinking about this, is there's a beautiful book by Bell Hooks called The Will to Change that I highly recommend, that has guided a lot of my work. And the point that Bell Hooks makes is that, first of all, we can't understand masculinity as a monolith. So that is to say, masculinity is a fact of life. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just, there's femininity, there's masculinity, there's everything in between. It's just like, being a man doesn't define you as a bad person. Something being masculine is not a bad thing. The problem is patriarchal masculinity, right? It's a system. It's a system that has taken a fact of life, masculinity, and made it toxic and violent and problematic, and has made us afraid. And, she talks about men who exhibit sort of violent or toxic behavior as people who are victims. And that doesn't mean that they are people who don't need to be held accountable for their actions. What she means is that everybody is born as this kind of, beautiful beings. We love to cry and sing and dance, and we learn things, and we're just uninhibited and innocent and all of these things. And at a certain point, when we're very, very little, men begin to be told that you can't do that anymore because it's not manly, that it's time to be a real man, that men don't do that, right? Men don't sing, men don't dance, men don't act that way, men don't cry, don't do this, don't do that. And that at that point, that little boy has become a victim of patriarchal masculinity. He's become a victim of a system that has robbed him of this joy and of this tenderness and of this ability to feel and connect to people in a way that is tender and soft and lovely, because those things are no longer acceptable. And that's where it all begins, right? So then we move through the world with all of these feelings repressed, right? Feeling that we can't be this, that we can't be that, that we must be this, we must be that. All of a sudden, those feelings and the ability to not express those feelings turn into anger, they turn into violence, and that's how then men hurt people. I mean, anyone can hurt anybody, and that's when it all becomes a performance, and when we start to create these kind of situations that allow us to be tender, but it's like no homo, like we're pretending like that's not a thing. And I think it's just really there has to be a lot of hard work to kind of dismantle all of that. And there's a great book by Maggie Nelson called The Argonauts. It's her memoir. And she has a passage in the book that I really loved where she's dating this man. He's a trans man. So he's someone who has navigated the world in the first part of his life, appearing to be a woman, and so understands what that feels like, but has now come into their full identity and is living as a male identifying trans person, and is also someone who passes, which, I hate that word, but it's someone who people see and don't know they're trans, so they're often just treated like a cis man. So now he's experiencing the world in this totally different way, right? So he has that duality. And Maggie Nelson is talking about male violence, and he says to her, men are actually quite nice. Like, they're just pretty nice people. And when I go around the street, men look at me and they nod and they say, "Hey, boss." And it's quite sweet, it's nice. And she says, and then Maggie Nelson's writing and she's thinking, she's like, "Oh, that's really interesting, because I feel like," and again, this is her writing and it's very generalized, but she says, "I feel like when I go around, women, we don't do that to each other. We don't nod to each other. We don't say, 'Hey, boss,' hey, how you doing?" We just kind of go about our own business. And she kind of starts to connect the dots and realizes that women don't have to do that with each other because there's an inherent safety. We don't have to signal to each other that we're safe. That is, the nod often means, I mean you no harm. That is, if our relationship is built on a foundation of violence, I must acknowledge you in a way that lets you know that I'm not going to kill you. And that's what the nod means. The nod means, hey, I come in peace, we're cool. And she says, women don't have to do that because we're safe with each other. So we don't have to go around acknowledging that I come in peace. Again, there's a lot of generalization in there, but I also think there's a kernel of truth, a big kernel of truth. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question necessarily, but we need to dismantle all of it and look at the intricacies and realize that it's not simple. It's not just men are bad, men are toxic, men are this. It's not masculinity is bad. There's a system that's bad. And we have been fed into the system, and it's gonna be really hard to kind of crawl ourselves back from it. And I think that it sometimes just starts with asking the question. It starts with having those conversations with your peers and modeling maybe, a softer, different type of masculinity that signals that there is safety in being together, in being tender, in being intimate. It doesn't have to be sexual, it doesn't have to be gay, it doesn't have to be any of those things. But someone mentioned to me recently that they had realized that men, again, there's some generalizations here, but that men generally only hug each other in a passionate way when someone dies. And I just thought that was really interesting as well. So anyways, I'll leave it at that for now, but happy to talk more, yeah.
I think I'd seen another hand back there. Is that right? Questions? I do have a question about your many questions, but I'm gonna start with mouth to mouth. And there was a really beautiful question in the class on Tuesday when we started talking about your work and about the role of intimacy. And you just talked a little bit about that and intimacy and tenderness. So I wonder if you can talk about intimacy and language and the ways that intimacy shows up in this work, and maybe also the tension between intimacy and distance, because it's showing up in really interesting ways for me in your work. And then maybe I'll have a follow-up question.
Yeah, I love that question. I'll give you some answers, but I'm also gonna think about that for a little while, but afterwards. But it is, language is a part of everything, right? And in fact, it's interesting because I moved here when I was 15. I'm a native Spanish speaker. I'm fully versed in Spanish, but one of the first things I noticed was that when I would go back to Peru, I couldn't go on dates or date or have sex or anything because I didn't know I didn't have that language. I was like, I have the language of a 15-year-old. I don't know how to talk about this stuff, So I was just like, how do you flirt in a different language? How do you say something that doesn't seem very dorky or you look very nice in those clothes, it was just really hard. It's because there's an intimacy in language that you achieve when you know a language in that way. That's really interesting. But it does appear, something that you'll see in the work and here is I love creating opportunities where the work can feel erotic if you want it to, but doesn't have to be. Boca a boca, which means mouth to mouth. Obviously, it's more commonly used in the context of resuscitation or kind of, medical sort of context, but, there's something very sensual and intimate about, boca a boca, about being mouth to mouth. It appears in lengua. It's one of my favorite words because it means both language and it means tongue. It's very similar in English too, and I find the tongue to be just a really cool and interesting part of the body. It is the thing that allows us to speak and to a degree and pronounce words, and even down to like being able to roll your R's or not roll your R's, which is a very sort of logistical but also intimate part of language, whether you can make your tongue behave in a certain way inside of your mouth. So yeah, I mean, I think I hadn't thought about it too much before, but it is, there is this way in which language shows up in very intimate parts of our lives and in equal parts of the distance. When I'm going to Peru and I'm trying to be intimate and I can't because I don't have the words for it. Like, what does that mean too, Yeah, and I'm happy to elaborate on that too if you have more thoughts as well. What do you think?
I mean, I have many thoughts. I want to make sure that I leave some space if other folks have more questions or if there's anything that has emerged in the Zoom. But I mean, so I will say this. One of the things I think about, of course, I'm a poet. I've written a poem about one of your works from Imagined Futures. And one of maybe the part B to my question is, and because we're also thinking about this in class, has to do with the ways that paper also acts like skin sometimes, and becomes a staging place for both intimacy and distance, especially at moments when we as immigrants and as artists are trying to connect back to places or times that are distant from us. So it's also very interesting to me the ways that you as an artist move between photography and this new work that is more text-based. And so I guess the part B to my question is also wondering how that movement happened.
Yeah. No, I love that because it is true, and to also somebody else's question about medium, that not only did I feel that this text had to be text, I also felt that it had to be handwritten by me, because I needed to leave a part of my body in the work. It needed to come through my hand, it needed to come through my body, and it was a very physical experience. There's 83 of them in the final installation, but I've made over 100, and some of them I had to write over and over again. And some I would just kind of get lost and then realize that I totally flipped the letters. And I think I can't remember, there's one or two here that actually came from the process of making them when I I misspelled something and I was like, oh, I like that better, or I had to do it again. But there was, for me, an intimacy with the objects themselves that was really important. Because I could have, I went through the gamut of do I letterpress them? How do I choose a font? What does that mean? What size are they? I mean, there's just a million ways this could have happened. It could have been a book. Maybe, I'm even thinking, I'd love for this to become a book. What would that look like? How would that even function? I was thinking about that yesterday. But it was important to me that there was this connection of my body and my hand kind of transferring the words to the paper, and that it existed in this way. Yeah.
And that also connects a little bit to what you all are doing in class and kind of the intimacy of working with words. We are almost at time. So what I want to invite is, we had you as a guest last quarter, and at Evergreen, I don't know if some of you are familiar with the ritual. Speaking of rituals, with the ritual of the give back. Anybody here? more or less. So there's somebody back there. So this is something that comes from our Tacoma campus. And there's a really beautiful ritual of giving back. So when a guest speaker arrives, and gives us all these gifts and offerings, folks will do a give back. So to simply say, this is one thing that stayed with me, here is one idea that I'm thinking about, that I want to take with me. So I'm going to give folks just a minute to think about that. I'm going to invite people to kind of popcorn out one give back to Rafael for the beautiful talk today. So we're going to give everybody just a minute to think about one thing that you are taking with you from today's talk. I'll see it's already happening.
Yeah, I mean, so many things, but gender reinforcement in sort of social, like children's social experience, and you related it to it a little bit. You put that in my head, but we relate to it a little bit different. But it just made me open up and revisit how that reinforces hierarchy and also how toxic masculinity. I've often said this hurts everybody because it reinforces feminine objectification, male objectification. And it's a system, it's a byproduct of a system that seeks to put everybody in a certain place. So you really, in the critical thinking of language and word, and that there is not these are not accidents, these are intentional, and so thank you.
Thank you.
For me, your photo booth photos being stolen really resonated with me, and like some people could consider that being like a devastating disaster, but for me I really like the idea that like adds to the art, and specifically what you were saying about like how like this devastating event reflects and encapsulates the idea you were originally going for, which was the idea of loss and letting go. And I just really like the idea of that random events can add to the art that weren't originally intended.
Thank you.
I'm just thinking about Tomb Boy and this idea that like queerness in the system that we're living brings like a vulnerability to violence in these things that happen.
For me, I was thinking about when you said how there are some people who are asking for like translations for your work and you decline, and that really stuck with me because I relate to my community and we relate to like having to adjust ourselves and to strip away most of our story just so it can be palpable for others to take in. And I love that you've refused to do that, and I think that's something we all should do more, and I really respect that. So that's one of the things that stuck with me.
Thank you.
It was really beautiful when you were talking about the portraits, and you maybe not use that word, that you did of yourself in the photo booths, and this kind of idea of an imagined future of, what could have been if you had stayed in Peru. And it made me think of what if my family stayed in Peru, and it's something I've thought about my entire life. And when you said that it's okay to like tell that like spirit, that like soul, that it's okay for it to go and to be with someone else or to live a different life, it was really touching because it's something I've never really thought about in my own thoughts as an American person of the Peruvian diaspora. So it's very touching and very personal in a way. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
For me, I'm going to take away what you said about like how you can't run away from where you come from, and like eventually you have to go back and like do some work, because like that's definitely something I've thought about ever since I moved from my hometown. Is like I don't really want to go back and live there, but like I feel a calling to go back for some reason.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the edges of violence and the edges of pleasure, and the ways that you've investigated and embodied or kind of pursued that through this ritual and performance. The act of reclaiming the confessional, something. Yeah, so I just really appreciate your language and the ways of kind of pushing boundaries outside of maybe traditional or normative ways of seeing the theme of violence or the theme of pleasure, and kind of opening pathways to pursue that further.
Thank you. I think there's one more, but I think. Oh, thank you.
I'm gonna take away when you said maybe the life I'm imagining is suited better for someone else. It resonated with me as someone in this class for my 16 credit project. I'm working with childhood, and like obviously I can't let go of my childhood because I've already lived it, but maybe like somewhere out there a version of me is still living in that childhood, so I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.
I really appreciated your like just kind of like talking about how engaging with work in context of your experience, because I think that I often struggle with this like, oh well, like how would an artist see this, or like what's like the critical way to see this, and I think that like I don't know, I'm definitely excited to go and engage in like more art with this like, oh, how does this resonate with me first, like on a personal level, what is my experience, and then I can get into like analysis and whatever, but just like I feel like especially noticing where it doesn't line up and being like, here's this like juxtaposition with where I'm at. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
There's sounds like we have some online.
Yes, so Tom on Zoom says, I'm thinking about your morning of the lives not lived and the ideas and the imagined future experience. The photo as a metaphor. I noticed that in a museum or in life, while looking at something, I take a photo and have an urge to not focus long on it. The photo taken provides an out from continuing the experience. And then Tom says, thank you for sharing your work and your time.
Thank you, Tom.
Anyone else? Back there.
As a trans woman, I relate to the whole toxic masculinity thing because having to grow up as a boy, I had to hide my femininity so much for my safety.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for. Do we have one more? One more.
I guess there were a couple of things new thoughts, because I've enjoyed your work for a while and always find new things. And right now I'm sitting with your relationship to your viewers and the ways that, like the generosity that is involved in opening multiple interpretive spaces in the ways that you place your work, but at the same time, holding certain kinds of ground around an integrity of the work, like not providing the translation for mouth to mouth. And if there's something in that that relates back to some of the questions in Soft Boy, right? Something about holding a ground with integrity. Maybe it's completely different, but I'm just trying to think about a road to a kind of relationality that can be tender, that can be generous and open, and also, we're not going to fuse completely into each other, right? There's going to be a way that we have some kinds of integrity. So I just love thinking about how you issue for invitations to be in community and relation with your viewers.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we are at time, so thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us, being here, and everything that you shared. And thanks to audience in presence and via Zoom. One last round of applause. And thank you also to our media team who makes these events possible. Thank you all.
You're filming that. You're like, I gotta go.